It took less than a week for NPR to suspend veteran editor Uri Berliner for writing an essay, which appeared in Bari Weiss's Free Press, about alleged bias against conservative voices and a rigidly progressive mindset that exists at NPR. Now, he also lobbed an accusation that NPR, quote, lost America's trust. Here are some excerpts from Berliner's Free Press essay. An open-minded spirit no longer exists within NPR, and now, predictably, we don't have an audience that reflects America. That wouldn't be a problem for an openly polemical news outlet serving a niche audience, but for NPR, which purports to consider all things, it's devastating both for its journalism and its business model. Many NPR colleagues tweeting their anger about Berliner last week. Political reporter Danielle Kurtz-Slaben tweeted, "Not that you asked my opinion, but newsrooms run on trust. If you violate everyone's trust by going to another outlet and shitting on your colleagues while doing a bad job journalistically for that matter, I don't know how you do your job now." And newly installed President Katherine Maher wrote a memo to NPR staff, part of which read, "We recognize that this work is a public trust, one established by Congress more than 50 years ago with the creation of the public broadcasting system. In order to hold that trust, we owe it our continued rigorous accountability when we are asked questions about who we serve and how that influences our editorial choices. We should be prepared to respond." Now, the reaction from the right has been swift, calling the network biased and partisan and renewing calls to withdraw funding. Even former President Trump and Elon Musk have weighed in. And now conservative writer Christopher Rufo has dug up some old tweets that this newly installed NPR chief executive, Katherine Maher, had posted, including one that called former President Trump a racist. It has since been removed. He also found this tweet in which she expressed support for President Biden. This is just the latest maelstrom in a mainstream media newsroom over left versus right. And she has a lot of other tweets that Rufo and also Matt Taibbi pointed to in his Substack. I would describe them as kind of self-parody wokeness. Like, I would have thought they were fake if they were not genuinely hers. In one from October of 2016, she called on Hillary Clinton to not use the language of boy and girl because it's a racing language for non-binary people. She just tweeted, an otherwise utterly uneventful day of academic nerdery and international travel, except for the metric FUCK ton of misogyny, complaining about racist uncles at Thanksgiving, etc. It's a lot of that kind of chatter. So anyway, in terms of suspending Uri Berliner, how do you feel about that?
I'm not super moved by the idea that complaining about your uncle being racist is woke or a problem. I think racism is bad. As to the question of whether or not this person it should be let go of NPR, it's an interesting question and one that the right is really dealing with right now. Are you allowed to have outlets with an ideological bent and then fire people from those outlets when they do not match the ideological bent of that outlet? This is what the Daily Wire. This is what the folks at the Daily Wire are going through right now after having dismissed Candace Owens for having guests on and being, in some respects, pro-Palestine. Now, I think the real outrage with the Daily Wire was that they had really framed themselves as being a free speech outlet and framed themselves as being free speech absolutists and really making a lot of their bread and butter calling out other people for having an authoritarian approach to speech. I'm not sure that NPR is in that same place. And I'm also not especially surprised by the liberal, NPR, I don't know that it's quite the gotcha that NPR employee likes Biden, is wearing a Biden hat, is a liberal. It's a very liberal outlet. Reagan already defunded NPR for political reasons, and it only gets about 11% of its funding from the government right now. If the Republicans want to keep pushing to get it more and more defunded, it can try to do that. We are in a media crisis where independent media organizations are only able to function through a benevolent billionaire. And when that billionaire decides to drop the ball, then incredibly important outlets are forced to close down. That's just what's happening to The Intercept right now. And so I personally have more concerns about the fact that we only get to have media in this country if a billionaire decides it should be so than I do about government funding to a media source like NPR. I'd rather have a diversity, at very least, of funding if we can't have genuinely people-funded programming. But in terms of people-funded programming, NPR is way ahead of the game with with it being substantially supported by member donations and the like. So I have put a lot more trust and faith in them not having the same kinds of corruption issues that other kinds of papers run by Jeff Bezos or even someone like Elon Musk will have. There's no perfect world, but I do wonder about the asymmetry here between the focus on NPR for having a Biden-wearing hat employee and something like what's going on at the Daily Wire.
I don't think, obviously, that the president, the new leader of NPR, supports Biden, as I don't really think the big issue. Now, of course, this does matter because, as you point out, they get government funding. Like, I'm obligated to pay for. It comes out of all our tax money, what they're doing editorially. And what they've done editorially, as Berliner pointed out, was manufacture a lot of the same mistakes that the other outlets you're describing that are billionaire funded or corporate funded, like the Washington Post, made as well, having to do with Russiagate and COVID and other things. I think it's frankly interesting that media organizations under totally different or somewhat different funding models could, because of the uniformity of the elite mainstream progressive or democratic consensus, could have gone wrong on so many of those same subjects.
Well,
in
just
terms
like
of him getting,
like the Daily Wire and the mainstream liberal media are aligned on something like Israel, right? There are certain kind of mainstream consensus views that are shared across independent versus mainstream lines. It happens all over the place.
Yeah. In terms of him getting suspended, so I do think, look, if you criticize your employer without seeking permission to, could I write an article about what's going on in our newsroom for someone else, and you do that, the reality is most media organizations, most workplaces in general, might take some kind of action based on that. So I don't think it's utterly outrageous or anything for them to say, we actually don't like that you did that. You should have, aired these things internally, or you should have asked us if you were going to do this, and so here is some punishment. I'm glad they didn't fire him. They just suspended him. That said, I think it doesn't look good optically to, if they're trying to insist, oh no, we do have, maybe they're not even trying to insist that. Maybe they're not making any pretense to having intellectual diversity or caring what people outside of their progressive worldview think. If they do have any pretense toward caring about that, punishing someone for politely expressing an opinion on some of the times they got things wrong because of their groupthink on liberal subjects, I think it is a very bad look. And I think, are all the people criticizing him now, are they going to get in the same trouble for raising internal issues publicly? Like, who gets to dissent? Who gets to speak up? Because, in the New York Times Tom Cotton op-ed controversy thing, when everyone was slamming their own paper, including Nicole Hannah-Jones, did she face any discipline? Of course not. So it's like you can only get in trouble for speaking up if you're validating something that a conservative or a non-progressive, I guess, thinks about your media institution, is the concern being expressed here. But maybe they don't care about ideological diversity because,
I'm really struggling with the idea that people are only canceled if they are conservative leaning
within the progressive mainstream.
So what you're really saying is that whenever you are ideologically opposed to the environment that you're in, you can suffer backlash, whether you're a conservative in a progressive environment or someone who's not even really progressive, but at least, let's say, pro-Palestine in a conservative environment, right?
When all the people said the New York Times is systemically racist for running the Tom Cotton op-ed, including people who work at the paper, did any of them get in trouble?
Right,
No.
and similarly, there is a pro-Israel ideology at a conservative site, and if you speak contrary to that, you'll get canceled. So I would like to be able to cover speech issues without constantly feeling like the gist of it is, but the left is especially censorious.
No, I'm not saying the left is especially censorious. And I'm not even saying,
let's clarify then.
And not the mainstream.
The liberals are especially censorious because they're not. Well, they're not. I don't, because I'm not seeing where is there. We're literally going through a complete and total breakdown of the right media ecosystem, and to be in the situation that we're in, and to pretend like this is the issue. To be in a world where we have a Muslim valedictorian who is being told she can't give her valedictorian speech because they're afraid she might say something about Gaza, I guess. When we're in a world where they're about to have another congressional hearing on campus speech held by Republicans about campus speech issues that are making students who are pro-Israel feel unsafe, when there has not been a single hearing on the 3 Palestinian students that were shot at Brown. I mean, it feels like conservatives are very effective at framing, and with the help of a great deal of people who I would once have considered leftists, are doing a very good job of framing this issue as a kind of liberal or left authoritarian bias. And what I'm seeing routinely is that people in a outlet or in a space where they have their ideological priors use whatever power is at their disposal to make their agenda the predominant one. And so what you're seeing is who has the most power. Who is most effective is who has the most power. And sometimes that's the New York Times. Sometimes that's Ben Shapiro. Sometimes the New York Times stuff is cutting in either direction. Sometimes there is a writer that is powerful enough and famous enough at the New York Times, like Nicole Hannah-Jones, who was able to resist any kind of backlash against her. All of those things are true. But I think so much of this is not ideological in terms of the bent of it, but is very much about who has the power and resources to advance their own interests, which is why kids getting shot can't advance their interests in Congress, because Democrats and Republicans in Congress are very pro-Israel on the whole. Do you know what I'm saying?
Well, yeah, but on virtually all of those instances, I agree that there was censorship, or it was unjust, or it was, the people who shot those kids should be locked away in jail.
But this should be in the would-be, but it's not that your subjective opinion.
That shouldn't mean that I can't be concerned or frustrated or making fun of the CEO of NPR when she tweets that ideological diversity is a dog whistle for anti-feminist, anti-POC stories about meritocracy. Does the CEO of a publicly funded, taxpayer-supported media institution has tweeted 5 years ago that ideological diversity is a racist dog whistle? I think we have a right to be upset about that. I think we have a right to say, okay, then you don't get government funding.
Okay, well, you guys have already tried that, and now they largely subsist without government funding. So, we're going to live in a world where the government doesn't do anything because some people who are part of our community don't agree with you. And I think that that's wrong. I think that Ron DeSantis attacking publicly funded universities in Florida, saying that they cannot have certain disciplines of study, going after African American history departments because he doesn't think that's worthwhile course of study,
I've opposed that, but you're just
is a
changing
problem.
the subject.
I'm not changing this. I'm not trying to change the subject. I'm trying to actually put in context what's happening in the United States of America. The Supreme Court just declined to rule on whether 3 states could ban protests. Perspective is necessary here. There's a little quip in his article that says NPR is supposed to consider all things because, of course, they have a very popular show called All Things Considered. Considering something and validating it, agreeing with it, and deciding to give it equal time is not the same thing. Do you want them to consider flat earthers? Do you want them to consider Nazis? There have to be some guardrails here, and what we're really talking about is where those guardrails should be placed. And
yes,
there have been instances where you're right, where they, I think, because of their ideological blinders, were unwilling to take on what ended up being real news stories about COVID, about yeah, and I agree with those aspects of it.
And we're calling on the things she's past tweeted to say maybe that is indicative of a mindset that creates this kind of reality.
I think that's really a distraction. And to the extent that there are journalists who are focusing more on whether or not someone who worked at NPR once wore a Biden hat, I can't stand Biden.
I don't care about that part.
But you do care because you raised it, right?
No, I don't care about the supporting Biden or whatever part of that. I care about her saying that ideological diversity is a dog whistle for racism. That mindset gets you to a place where you ignore contrarian or outsider views, right and left, who are trying to contradict the things that mainstream liberal establishment supporting Democrats think, and those blinders resulted in the errors that Berliner raised in his reporting, which, by the way, don't all break conservative, right? Russiagate is something that you and
I think that's completely fair, and I'm frustrated with that comment because my critique of NPR is that it has been deeply liberal, and the fact that it does have to take all these corporate donations, I think, has affected its coverage in recent years. When you hear an advertisement for a bank and then they go on to talk about their view on inflation and how the economy is performing, I do wonder how that affects their coverage. And they have not been friendly to the left interest. They were not especially friendly to people like Bernie Sanders. And I feel like that was limiting and bad. They're not especially friendly at all to third-party coverage. And I think that their blinders on ideological diversity are a problem. I just wish sometimes we could have these conversations without feeling like I have to agree with that it's a bad thing to say, I don't like my uncle saying racist things at the dinner table, or that it's a bad thing, or that, I voted for Biden. Half of Americans voted for Biden.
Yeah,
like,
I
don't think that's an indictment. You can't work in media if you voted for a mainstream presidential candidate in the last cycle. I mean, that's getting a little bit bizarre. That's all I'm saying.
She also called St. Patrick's Day in New York. She said St. Patrick's Day in New York and only hours before the MTA is ankle deep in green vomit. Do other countries have drinking holidays? So a little anti-Irish.
Have you been in New York for St. Patrick's Day?
I support ethnic solidarity movements, so the Irish get there.
Let's see how the conservatives talk about Caribbean Carnival and things like that when those parades happen in New York City.
All right, we'll have more Rising right after this.